Thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for the privilege of addressing you here at this prestigious event. And congratulations to all of the laureates. I think last week you might have heard of Omicron, a variant that kind of took over the news cycle. We started counting cases, countries, describing what different governments were doing. And it seemed much like the early days of the pandemic, where every form of media and every individual turned into a tracker. But actually, a lot has changed over the past 23 months. And most recently, the example of that is what South Africa was able to do with Omicron, being able to sequence it and analyze those sequences to show that it had mutations in number and location that predicted potential worrying changes in the behavior of the virus. The COVID-19 pandemic has ruled our lives with ups and downs and restrictions and regulations and advances and setbacks in medicine and in science. And we've had a flood of information where it has been difficult to understand what is false, what is conjecture, what is imperfectly clear, and what is certain, at least at that point in time. This pandemic is the most measured and most tracked event in human history, and science, as much as politics and policy, has played a key role. The deluge of data that we've had from the spread of the virus in humans and in animals, the clinical consequences of infection, the pathology of disease, virus genomics, treatment approaches, the safety, the efficacy, the impact of vaccines, all of this to expand, even as our ability to analyze and interpret the data evolves. But the sheer volume of information that we have is not necessarily an immediate explanation of why we are where we are, much less what the future might hold. In a chaotic system, when we deal with new circumstances, there is a limit to accurate prediction about next waves, about the danger of new variants, or the long-term effectiveness of new vaccines. And when scientists try to convey the limits of our current understanding or uncertainty about what the future might hold, they actually struggle to be heard over the authoritative and authoritarian voices that come from those that advocate for unproven traditional remedies at one end to the bypassing of due process from a misplaced sense of patriotism at the other. It seems difficult today for any science regarding the pandemic to be apolitical, and perhaps the swings between excessive deference and excessive skepticism are a consequence of how our society functions. Nonetheless, the current pandemic has resulted in an increased awareness of science in society, even though what constitutes scientific expertise and credibility is viewed through different lenses by different audiences. This polarization and the attendant conspiracy theories are not unique to India. And it's actually interesting for me that while Indian and Asian cultures in the 20th and 21st centuries have recognized the necessity of science as a means of individual advancement, collectively somehow we seem to hold different views. Whether it is the IITs or IISc, the brightest students have traditionally been directed to science, and those individuals in India and globally have shown their caliber in the application of science and technology in great measure, but not necessarily in discovery at quite the same level. The importance of the application of science was highlighted by the Government of India in 1958 in its scientific policy resolution, which stated the dominating feature of the contemporary world is the intense cultivation of science on a large scale and its application to meet a country's requirement. Further, when the fundamental duties were added to the Constitution of India in 1976 through Article 51A. The eighth duty stated, it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and spirit of inquiry and reform, making our constitution one of the few that requires this as a fundamental, foundational aspect of our society. The term scientific temper is often attributed to Jawaharlal Nehru, but was first used in the 19th century by a Jesuit scholar. Bertrand Russell used it in 1922 to describe the acceptance of the theory of relativity by the world as an example of true scientific temper. Essentially, Einstein's theory upset the theoretical framework of traditional physics, and yet physicists were ready to accept it as soon as the evidence was in its favor. Yet the theory wasn't considered the last word. To quote Russell, he has not built a monument of infallible dogma to stand for all time. There are difficulties he cannot solve. His doctrines will have to be modified in their turn as they have modified Newton's. This critical, undogmatic receptiveness is the true attitude of science. While Russell's description of scientific temper referred to the scientific community, Nehru actually brought that framing to society, and I quote, "The scientific temper points out the way along which man should travel. It is the temper of a free man. We live in a scientific age, so we are told, but there is little evidence of this temper in the people anywhere or even their leaders. What is needed is the scientific approach, the adventurous yet critical temper of science, the search for truth and new knowledge, the refusal to accept anything without testing and trial, the capacity to change previous conclusions in the face of new evidence, the reliance on observed fact and not on preconceived theory, the hard discipline of the mind. All this is necessary, not merely for the application of science, but for life itself and the solution of its many problems." For researchers, this direction of travel, of being skeptical, of evaluating their data, and tracking back to test its integrity and plausibility, the refusal to test or accept anything which has not been tried. This has been lacking or limited in the past 2 years, whether it is the need, the timing, the mechanisms of lockdown, the approach to testing, the evaluation of drugs developed by national agencies, or treatment protocols that included drugs like hydroxychloroquine a year after they had been shown to be clearly ineffective. But perhaps this has actually been a missed opportunity for scientists and for policymakers that do believe in the essentiality of a scientific temper in society. When newspapers track numbers and try to decipher what they mean for the present and the future, this is actually an opportunity for the communication of the value of science and a way to counter the challenges that are brought about by a lack of scientific temper as a way of life that questions and analyzes data. This need was recognized by many people's science movements in the 1970s, similar to the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, which was established in 1962. Many of these movements have faded since then and need to be reinvigorated. This issue of escape into magical beliefs and instant solutions, as Raja Ramana said, was and is recognized by scientists, but channels of communication between scientists and society remain limited, reflected in the widespread of disinformation about the pandemic and the burgeoning of belief in unproven methods of treatment. For science to be trusted and valued, we have to move beyond the employment opportunities of an IIT graduate and understand that there can be no division between science and society. In the past few centuries, in this pandemic, and certainly in the future, the history of the world has been and will be shaped by the countries that lead in science and intellectual exploration. For any nation and society, world-leading science is a matter of prestige and a contribution to excellence, not only in the country, but to the world. Science will be trusted and will serve us best if it accords with the principles of transparency, openness, and very importantly, inclusivity. In our society and in our scientific institutions, we have too often and for far too long had blind spots that have ignored caste, creed, and gender. We need not only to ensure that we recognize our biases and restrictions in the way that we deal with lines of research and in the ways that policy which affects all of us without necessarily considering all of us. Again, there can be no division between science and society. The most urgent scientific and technological needs of our society during the pandemic, such as tests, drugs, and vaccines, as well as the most basic and fundamental scientific lines of inquiry, emanate from a social fabric and time, with its attitudes, needs, and limitations. As a society, can we survive without scientific temper? It is, of course, feasible in an interconnected world that allows for expertise, production, and services, not always needing to be co-located where the requirement is. But as a nation and a society that visualizes the humane, inclusive, and environmentally sound future that is embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, as a nation and a society that seeks to develop our ability to empower our citizenry through health and education in preparation for a productive future. As a nation and a society that seeks to thrive, we need an understanding, application, communication, and appreciation of the science that supports us in all our goals. Recognition of exploration, innovation, and responses to challenges in science and in society is the goal of the Infosys Prizes. The prizes highlight what and how individuals and the teams they lead have contributed to solving problems in their field and have created the role models of science and scholarship that you saw today. The Infosys Science Foundation goes beyond the prizes to create the opportunities for sharing the journey of exploration, the many failures, occasional triumphs, and the value of both those experiences. It seeks to change the environment around critical thought and exploration, and that is essential to our world today. Thank you once again for the privilege of sharing in the recognition of the accomplishments of the Infosys laureates today.